So returning back to our fundamental principle, in perfectly competitive market, no firm realizes economic profits or rents. What's interesting is that the existence of economic profits suggests that there's actually some type of market inefficiencies. Now, for those of you who've studied economics, or for those of you who've just even paid attention in the popular business press, this notion that profits are generated from market inefficiency might seem very, very counterintuitive at first. So let me illustrate why this is the case. So I'd like to take a few minutes here to talk about basically Economics 101 in the context of competitive markets. What we see represented here on the slide is a generic industry here where we have supply, represented by S, and demand, represented by D. On the horizontal axis, the x-axis, we have the quantity demanded within an industry, or quantity sold within an industry. On the y-axis, or the vertical axis, we have dollars, for example, the price that a good sells for. Now, if you've taken economics, you might remember the classic adage that price is set where supply equals demand. You see illustrated here. So the price in a given market is set where our supply curve crosses our demand curve, and that also determines the amount or quantity of goods sold within that market. The reason we assume the demand curve goes down is that for any given price, if you raise that price, fewer people will demand that product, or conversely, if you lower the price, more people will demand that product. On the flip side, with supply, as you raise the price, you need to provide more, sell more to justify selling that higher price. Hence the just simple curves that we represent here. Now, this is what we see at the industry level. What does this mean for a firm? So here we see two additional curves, MC and AC. MC stands for marginal cost. This is the incremental cost to the firm of selling one additional unit of a good or service. AC stands for the average cost. The average cost is the average cost per unit sold. The reason we draw the curves in the way that we have is that for the average cost curve, for example, we start with typically some type of fixed cost that you incur. So consider the following example. Imagine someone selling t-shirts outside of a sports stadium here at the university. We have supply and we have demand for those t-shirts, and we have a market that determines a price and quantity that are going to be sold and the price that it's going to be sold for. For an individual t-shirt vendor, they are what we call a price taker. They don't get to set the price. Now, of course, they have discretion. They could choose to set the price at whatever level they want, but the market will not bear that out. So, for example, if they charge more than the market price, they simply won't sell any t-shirts. So at the end of the day, they are compelled to offer the market price, hence what we call a price taker. Their average cost curve has the curve as follows because they incur some fixed costs in selling t-shirts. They have to buy a van, perhaps, maybe they have to get a table. They, of course, have the printing equipment and the like to make just that one t-shirt. So the cost to sell one t-shirt is quite high. But as they sell more and more of those t-shirts, the average cost per t-shirt sold comes down. However, at some point, they'll reach some capacity constraint. Perhaps they have to hire another van or maybe another worker to help them sell those t-shirts. As they reach those capacity constraints and they incur additional costs, that will then raise the average cost per unit sold. The question before us for the firm is, how many t-shirts should I bring to the stadium that I'm trying to sell? What am I likely to sell at the given market price? How many do I want to sell at the end of the day? Well, the answer is, in a perfectly competitive market, you want to sell the quantity such that the price equals your marginal cost. Now, how did I come up with this? Where did this come from? Let me take a few minutes here to do a little calculus. My apologies for those of you not mathematically inclined. I think this is useful to go through for those of you who have had some background in calculus just to establish this baseline. If you haven't, don't worry. We'll come get you back up to speed in a second here. First, let's start with the profit equation. Very simply, profits equal revenues, price times quantity, minus variable costs, the cost for selling that many units, minus any fixed costs that are incurred regardless of how many units are sold. Represented mathematically, we use the Greek symbol pi to represent profits. We have our revenues, once again, our price times our quantity sold. We have our variable costs, which we represent here as cost as a function of the quantity sold there. And then we have our fixed costs represented by the CF. Now, for those of you who have had some calculus, you might remember that if you're trying to maximize some objective function, you're trying to maximize profits in this case, you take the derivative with respect to the decision variable, in this case the quantity sold, and you set it equal to 0. Well, what happens in this case? The derivative of price times quantity, our revenue part of the equation, equals price. Our derivative of our cost, our variable cost part of the equation, we represent very simply as C prime Q1, which equals the derivative of that cost function. The fixed cost function is a fixed constant and therefore falls out of our derivative. We set that equal to 0, and it gives us a decision rule in which we set price equal to the derivative of variable cost, which is by definition the marginal cost. Hence again, to maximize profits, a firm who is a price taker sets quantity such that price equals marginal cost. Now, if you're not mathematically inclined, if you haven't had calculus, let me show you this visually here. What the calculus does for us is figure out where on that horizontal axis there to put Q1 so as to maximize profits. And if you don't believe me, you can play around with it on the graph here. Q1 times P1 gives us our revenue, represented by the green shaded area. Q1 times AC, where it crosses that line, gives us our cost. Our average cost per unit times units sold gives us our total cost, represented in the red. And our profits are all those green area that remains there. So let's go back to our t-shirt vendor. If you're a t-shirt vendor and you're selling t-shirts outside the stadium, you're making a hefty profit here, you're doing very well. That's very exciting for you. But what happens next? Well, one might expect that others will observe you making good money selling t-shirts outside the stadium, and they'll decide, well, they'd like to sell some t-shirts as well. They'd like to get some of that action. So what happens then to our competitive markets? Well, the first thing it does is that those coming in to sell t-shirts, entering the market, shift out the supply curve. There are now, at any given price, more t-shirts being willing to be supplied by the marketplace. However, our laws of supply and demand still hold true. Price equals where supply equals demand. So the effect of those entering the market and shifting out the supply curve is to lower prices and increase aggregate demand, where we see from P1 to P2 and from Q1 to Q2. So once again, it shifts out supply, lowers prices, increases overall demand. But let's see what the effect of this is on the firm. The firm, once again, is a price taker. They have to take the market brand price, which is P2. But they still have the same decision rule, which is to set quantity such that price equals marginal cost, as you can see represented by Q2. P2 times Q2 gives us our revenue. Q2 times AC gives us our cost. Well, look what happens. In this example here, profits are competed away. Now, to be technically correct again, economic profits are competed away. It is possible to have accounting profits in a competitive market. And the reasoning is as follows. As more and more individuals enter into our t-shirt vending market outside the stadium, eventually one of them will recognize that if they enter in, it will lower price so far that it really isn't worth their effort to enter in and sell those t-shirts. In essence, their opportunity cost is high enough that they choose not to enter into the market. And this is why we're so clear about economic profits when we talk about the fundamental principle here. So in competitive markets, these economic profits are competed away, and you're basically indifferent to the profits you make from that endeavor versus some other type of investment of similar risk. Maybe it's just simply investing in some type of mutual fund or other type of investment vehicle.